Hey, welcome everybody to AOPA's Don't Get Rusty. Glad to have you here and on this April 18th. Today's episode or today's topic, as you can see, is IFR charts, VFR magic. And the goal today is to make night flying a little safer using IFR charts. So we are glad to be here with you again and glad to have you here with us. So let's just jump to the next slide. A little bit of housekeeping as we always do very quickly. Just want to make sure you understand how to use the menu in case you're new. So if you're on a PC, we're looking at this one, attendee control panel using a computer. So the basic deal here is what you want to do is look for that little question, looks like a little cartoon conversation or statement bubble or whatever, has a question mark in it. Then down here, you want to type in your question and make sure that you hit the send button. Otherwise, we won't see it. And if you happen to be on a tablet of some sort, iPad or Android or something like that, then it'll look something like this. You'll have a little question mark right up here. When you tap on it, it should pop up this window, type in your question, and again, make sure you hit send. And then don't forget that we have an admin panel, so we will see every response that comes in, and we even gives us a timestamp on when it came into the second. So that is all good. As always, my name is Chris Moser. Glad to be here with you. I'm AOPA's Senior Director of Flight Training Education. And as you can see, there are some of the information about me on the screen. The biggest thing I do here at AOPA is working with CFIs and flight schools. And as always, I am glad to be joined by Dan Justman. Hey, Dan.
Good afternoon, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely day in Central Maryland. I hope it is as lovely as wherever you are tuning in from. Happy to be here. I get to work with Chris and all the other You Can Fly initiatives, our high school initiative, flight training, flying clubs, and Rusty Pilots initiatives. Get to lead these great teams that develop and support and help grow the general aviation pilot community. And with that, would love to introduce our friend, Stephen Schroeder. Say hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen.
Yeah. So, coordinator, Flight Training Initiative. I work directly with Chris Moser on a variety of projects and things throughout the year, including producing this lovely program every month, which is always a whole lot of fun. And then also, lurking in the background, we have another helper today.
Hello,
Chris Horwath.
So say that again, Chris. So we got Chris Horwath in the background helping us out today as well. So say hello, Chris.
Hello, Chris.
So glad to have you on board here, Chris and Stephen. And Dan, I know that you would like to talk a little bit about the AOPA Foundation.
Absolutely. All programs from the You Can Fly series of initiatives and also the AOPA Air Safety Institute are all funded by individuals and organizations that believe strongly in general aviation safety, making it better. So none of the stuff that we do, including us, are funded by AOPA member dues. So if you like what you see, you'd like to be a part of it, you'd like to support, please do support the AOPA Foundation and all the programs that we are able to run. We appreciate your generosity. Please visit aopafoundation.org.
And Dan, how about hitting some of our top questions?
Question number one, do you get wings credit? You will if you are watching this program live. If you are watching it recorded, you will not be able to get wings credit. But if you are watching live and you have registered with your FAAsafety.gov email address, that's all you need to do. We will take care of it. We will submit in a couple days' time. You will see that credit show up on your account. If you're not sure which email address is, please email to, it is ftinitiative@aopa.org, ftinitiative@aopa.org, and let us know that you would like that email address to be used for your wings credit. Question number two, is this being recorded? Well, I alluded to that just a moment ago. Yes, we are recording this webinar. You can see it on YouTube, the AOPA Pilot Video channel, the Don't Get Rusty webinar playlist, and also you can find it at aopa.org, webinars.aopa.org, Don't Get Rusty playlist there as well. And that's all for now.
Very cool. Let me go ahead and click to the next one. There it is. Stephen, tell us a little bit about this day in aviation history.
All right, April 18th, 1952, the biggest jet bomber ever built, the Convair YB-60, made its first successful test flight at Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas. With a wingspan of 206 feet, it was basically just slightly bigger than a Boeing 787, which for 1952 is pretty impressive. Unfortunately, was just a prototype. It was quickly knocked out of production by the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. So, alas.
You can see some similarities to it. Looks as kind of the similar construction, or like you can see that in there. All right, anyway, very cool. All right, what are we doing today? So today, as I mentioned before, we're doing this idea of IFR charts, VFR magic. So we're going to learn a little bit about how you can use IFR, specifically the instrument approach charts today, to make your night flying a little bit safer. So we'll talk about some of the requirements for using them. We'll talk about where to find them, when it would be appropriate to do so, and how to interpret them. So for my instrument rated pilots out there, this will be likely just a very a simple review. But for my non-instrument rated pilots, this will be something I'm hoping that really will, open up your minds and maybe give you something you could start working on with a flight instructor. We'll also talk a little bit about obstacle departure procedures, or also DPs, departure procedures, and then where to find out more. There is a handout today, and on that handout, you'll see there's not a ton of links on there because most of this can be found in this book right here, the Instrument Flying Handbook from the FAA, or let me keep that right where I had it. If you're so inclined, Rod Machado's Instrument Pilot Handbook. We'll just throw a little plug out for that as well, but they're both very good books. And of course, the FAA book you can find for free online. All right, so Stephen, let's roll the poll with the question today being, which best describes your night flying experience? Is it A, I haven't gotten to try it yet? D, I've done it a little bit. C, quite a bit of night flying, but I'm still cautious. D, who needs light? I've got night vision goggles. And then E, nope, are you nuts? You can't see out there. So what do you think, Dan?
I think that we are going to land today on, I wish there was one more answer in there, that
Which
I
is what?
really like flying at night. It's smooth and it's beautiful, but I'm still cautious with that. So not sure if that would qualify as quite a bit of night flying time. But I'm going to say done a little. That's going to be our number one today.
All right, we're going to see what happens here. We've got about 65% voting. So let's see if we can get it up to that 75 to 80% mark before we do it. And yeah, I would think that, well, I'm hoping we get an answer of E, because I always enjoy those, or the D. But let me just think here. I'm thinking C would be our top answer. So
Quite a
let's see
bit.
what happens here. Yeah, I think quite a bit, but the cautious part. Maybe it should have been done it a little, like you said, and still cautious as well.
Yeah.
All right, looks like we have hit the 79% mark. All right, Stephen, go ahead and close the poll, and let's take a look at the results.
Yes.
All right, and I see people throwing in the comments as well. We got Santosh there saying, I prefer night. But here we go. It says, which best describes your experience? And as you can see, Dan, you were exactly right on, 56% saying, I've done it a little bit, and 34% coming in at 2. And of course, some people entertaining me with my dumb humor, the 3%, nope, are you nuts? Can't even see out there. So maybe what I can show you here will help a little bit too when it comes to doing some night flying. So
who needs light? I've got night vision goggles.
So exactly, I got my night vision. I'm good to go. And yes, I see. Yeah, we'll get some questions in there, and I know Dan is monitoring them. So what I wanted to show you first was this is a video that I made using X-Plane. This is actually, I did this a couple of years ago, but check this out. This was actually a nighttime approach, and what I mean by that is just coming into land at an airport that when I used to fly freight. So it's about, I want to say it's about 30 seconds to a minute long, but about halfway through, what I will do is I've got it set on night, so you can see I'm approaching the land, and about halfway through, you'll see me pause it and then change it to the daytime settings. So let's just take a quick look at that. Here it comes. So you can see I'm making the approach, move the mouse off the screen there. And you can see the runway straight ahead, and it all looks good, right? It's like everything should be clear, good to go. And then momentarily here I am pausing it. I change it to daytime, put it at noon, got plenty of light now as it restarts. And then if you can see over there to your left, off the left wing, I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm going to also pan over with the view on the airplane. So you can see the runway straight ahead, and then you might be able to see there's that terrain right over there to the left. And it's really not that far. You can see how close it is. So I can remember when I was flying freight doing that run. This is Lake Havasu, Arizona. And in fact, I'm going to go to the next slide that shows it. here is the airport, and you were coming in this way. So you're coming from out of the northwest, heading towards the southeast. And this is that terrain that you're seeing. And it really is, as you can see in the video there with the simulation, it is not that far away. And that used to freak me out. And that's why one of the things when I was flying, I got myself a little handheld GPS to help me do these things too. And of course, you could use the VOR as well. But flying in the dark out there like that, that was a little bit scary when you got terrain around you. And so this is just a zoomed in picture of the same thing. And don't worry, I am going to explain this type of chart and how you could potentially use this. But there again is the terrain you can see right here, 5,100 feet. And it's about, I remember Lake Havasu being somewhere in the 1,000-foot elevation mark. Okay, so that's kind of the thing that was said as the impetus of like, what can we do to make this a little bit safer? Because like I said, that used to scare me a bit, flying at night like that. And it made me a little bit nervous. And so I was trying to figure out what are ways that I can really make sure that I'm safe. And what I used to tend to do is I would kind of overcompensate and be higher and really just trying to be very, very cautious. But then it occurred to me I could use these instrument things to help us be even a little bit safer and more precise, and actually be on altitudes too, where I won't have to worry about, getting in and hitting anything. So requirements for using an instrument approach chart, or IAP, that's what it stands for, instrument approach procedure, IAP. And the biggest things for using this, and by the way, for everybody, this is not, we're not talking about instrument clearances or anything like that. This is all for VFR night flying. So VFR night, we're assuming the weather is clear, you're not getting in the clouds, and we are not getting an IFR clearance. But the things you would need to do for flying VFRs, obviously you need to be current and legal as PIC. So if you're carrying passengers, you need your 90-day currency, you need your flight review, all the things. If you're flying a high performance thing, making sure you've got your endorsements, etc. You would need the appropriate navigation equipment for what you're trying to use. So in the case of some of these, it would use a VOR. So you'd want to make sure you've got a VOR. And I would highly recommend that even though the 30-day check for the VOR accuracy is only required for instrument flight, if you were going to use this stuff at night, I would go ahead and do that VFR as well. Just make sure you check your VOR, and there's various ways of doing that. There's like 3 or 4 ways of doing that. Make sure you check to make sure that it's accurate before you go using it to try to help keep you safe at night, to make sure it's working properly. If some of these will use a GPS, like an IFR GPS, and you can learn how to do that as well and even use it under VFR. So make sure you've got an IFR certified GPS and that the database is current in it so that it's using the correct waypoints, and all the appropriate information there. And of course, get an appropriate briefing. Make sure you get your NOTAMs, make sure you know what's going on, make sure you know that you're going to be able to stay VFR as you're doing this. And then finally, and the biggest requirement of all of these is please use common sense. If it's not something you're familiar with or comfortable with, then don't do it. So I will talk about that, and I will emphasize that. Please use your good common sense on trying to do some of the things I'm going to talk about. And the biggest part of that is just getting preparation and training beforehand to help you do this. Any questions, Dan, before I move on?
No, we're good right now. Keep growing.
Okay. So where can I find these things, these instrument approach procedures? Well, I believe I put a link for the FAA's part. I did not put the airport directory link on the handout, but you can see it right there on the screen. It's just, if you just search AOPA airports, but in the AOPA airport directory for any particular airport, if you scroll down, there is a section that will show all the approach procedures. And honestly, I think that's the easiest place to find them. Especially if you're not using something like an electronic flight bag, because you can use the airport where you're going, and you could just go down and scroll and just hit it, and it's going to pop a little PDF, and you can just either save that or print it to take it with you in the cockpit. So by far, I think the easiest way to do it is look up your airport where you're going in the AOPA airport directory, and that's all, of course, free. I'm not sure if it requires member login or not, but hopefully all of you are mostly members anyway. And then you can also do things like the online flight planner. So things like SkyVector, that's the one that pops in my mind. I'm sure there are some other ones as well, but a lot of times they'll have it available as well. You can go to the FAA's website, and I know that I've got that link on the handout, and that will give you the entire book for a certain area. And it looks like these sort of books, but it's a whole digital file for it. It's a big file too. Like I said, it's probably easier to go get the ones where they pull them out. And then if you're using an electronic flight bag, you should find them in there as well. I'm not sure if the level of subscription would affect that. I would think that they would be available at any level since they're free. to the general public anyway, but just check your subscription. But for example, I know that ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot definitely have them in there. And you can, again, you just go to the airport, you can just pull up and you just hit procedures and learn how to find those.
And Chris,
And if you really
speaking of
want, one last one is just the idea of a paper book, and then you can get those at your local pilot shop. Go ahead, Dan.
Chris, so speaking of the EFBs, we had a note from PK that I thought was interesting. Looking at the nighttime airport in ForeFlight, and I guess it could be Garmin as well, I'm not sure of that capability, but it can be deceiving because it does not encounter city lights around the airport, so be careful there. And also, for newbies, taxiway and runway lights turning into LEDs can be confusing for new pilots, so just be aware of that lighting and do your best to be aware. So I thought those were some interesting comments from PK. Thank you for those comments.
Definitely good tips. And I see Scott just mentioned too, and it's something I'm going to emphasize. Believe it or not, Scott, I was even thinking ahead on this one, is that yes, all the stuff that I'm going to talk about, you should be practicing in the daytime before you try it at night. Don't go try these things at night. And the other thing you can do is practice them in a simulator as well. So these are both good ways of doing this before you would actually try doing any of this at night. Okay, so when is it appropriate to do it? When is it appropriate to use an instrument approach procedure to help you with your night flying? Well, obviously, VFR conditions only, all right? Unless you're instrument rated and on an instrument clearance and are instrument current and proficient, do not go try doing this in the clouds or anything like that. So, don't do anything like that, but VFR conditions only. And this would very likely be the same kind of conditions that you would expect for night flying that you would do anyway. This is just going to help you with that issue of like the terrain I showed you there at Lake Havasu. Deer Valley out in Arizona was the same way. We had these two little mountains off the end of the runway, or two little hills, as they would say out there, mountains to us East Coasters. And so the same deal where they were like, you kind of like were threading the needle, it felt like at times. And at nighttime, it was always a little scary. So maintain good situational awareness. That's why you want to use your charts, use your EFB if you've got that, because they'll show terrain as well. But you want to know where's the airspace, what altitudes are those, plan ahead, know where the terrain is. And even as I mentioned there, plan ahead, like really plan this out and make sure you know what's coming ahead of time. Nothing should be left for planning in the cockpit. You should already have all this sorted out before you would even take off. And then make sure you make very clear VFR radio calls, and I'll explain why for that in a minute. Because remember, you are flying VFR, so even though you might be using an instrument procedure, you are not on an instrument clearance. And even instrument pilots, if they were on an instrument clearance and they're in VFR conditions, they need to make VFR radio calls. So make sure you're making calls, letting the other traffic know where you are and what you're doing. Okay. So before we get into the chart, I believe this is the last text one before I get into talking about the actual charts and how to interpret them. When would it be appropriate? Well, when it's necessary for safety. And the reason that I say that is that, like, say you've got a really well-lit moonlight night and there's traffic in the pattern, you may not want to do this, mainly because of the fact that you're going to be doing a non-standard pattern entry. So rather than coming in on the 45 on the downwind, like we would always recommend for at a non-towered field, in this case, this is going to typically be bringing you in on a straight-in final. And so if it's not required for safety, there's a well moonlit night and there's traffic in the area, you're going to probably want to do your best to do that 45 entry. Otherwise, if you know there's not traffic and you really feel like it would enhance the safety of flight, then go ahead and try these out. And again, that's where those clear VFR calls come into play. Obviously, look for traffic. Make sure you know what's going on. Communicate. Look for traffic. Remember, you don't have priority over anybody else that may be in the pattern. So be careful. And the final part here, along with that good common sense, is go train this with a good CFI, because they'll be able. I'm sure they would have no problem taking someone who is say a private pilot and you haven't done your instrument rating yet, that just explain what it is you want to do, and I'm sure they would be glad to help you train in the sim, and then go up in the airplane and actually try it out. So that would probably be the most safe way to do this, or the safest way to do it. All right. So all that said, all that preloading, let's get into the nuts and bolts here of what we're talking about. The picture on the left is found in the Instrument Flying Handbook, and they've got a whole bunch of those. That's that FAA one. There is a link on the handout that will get you here. And in fact, I believe I say later on, it's in the first chapter that a lot of this is. It explains what they are, and then I'm going to explain the basics of what you need to know. And don't worry if you can't quite see the fine details here, because I'm going to zoom in on each section of this particular chart just to explain what's going on. And I purposely chose one that was relatively simple, because they can get more and more complicated, and that's where you'd want to dive deeper if you decide you want to use one that's more complicated, to dive deeper. But preference would be to pick one that's easy and simple like this one. So the cool thing is in the instrument flying handbook, they have these pages like this where they kind of just give you, you know, a little bit of detail and pop things out. But we're going to take a look specifically today. The first one we're going to look at is this VOR runway 34 approach into Carroll County. It's right here. This one happens to be right here in Maryland near Frederick. And I chose it because it's a very simple approach. So let's take a look at the next slide here. On this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this out in a second. So we're going to start with looking at this top section. And then even though I'm not going to zoom in on this one here on the right shows you the effective dates for this approach. You want to make sure that your chart is current. And if you're going to the AOPA airport directory or you've downloaded all the appropriate downloads in ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, you should have the most current one, but it's always a good idea to check it. And so it's very easy to see. This one just says this one's valid 21 March 2024 to 18 April 2024. So as long, you know, as we're good to go. And in fact, today this one expires. So if I was going to use an approach like this, I would want to get the next one starting tomorrow. Questions, Dan, before I move on?
We're okay. Keep going.
All righty. So here is me zooming in. I'm going to just go back one right here. You can see there's that top section. So I'm going to zoom in on each of the sections to make it a little bit easier to see. And this is that part where I'm emphasizing again, there is an IFR 30-day VOR check required for safety. So I would definitely do that if you're going to be using these VFR at night. That's under 91-171. And there it mentions a couple different ways of doing that. But let's take a look at this thing. It's called the briefing strip and the procedure ID. So this whole thing is basically used when you're flying instruments to brief the approach, but it's got some really useful information here. Number one, the main nav aid over here used for this approach is this VORTAC. It's the EMI or the Westminster VORTAC, and the frequency for it is 117.9er. If you're not great at VORs, this is a good opportunity to get better at them and learning how to do this. You will see things like channel 126 and some other odd frequencies. And just like on the VFR charts, those tend to be their military things that they would use for their equipment. This is going to let me know too that the final approach course, or like basically that final approach coming in this case, it's sort of an offset final. It's not exactly a straight in, is 358. It gives you information next to that about the length of the runway. In this case, the runway you'd be landing on is 5,100 feet. It gives you the TDZE or touchdown zone elevation. And by the way, I know you're not going to remember all this from me just talking about it once. There is a legend found in the book that comes with the approach charts, just like you'd see in a sectional. There's a whole legend that has pages of this. The instrument flying handbook covers a lot of this. It's just copies of that. And even in, like, I know I happen to be using ForeFlight right now, and ForeFlight's got it built into there too if you go into the document section. So just don't worry if you don't remember all these things that I'm going to mention. So the touchdown zone elevation is going to give you the altitude for that first little bit of the runway where you should be touching down. And it gives you the airport elevation as well. You'll see a section right here. This just gives you an idea. This is really for instrument purposes. So for you flying VFR at night, should not really be a factor, but this just tells you that there are, you know, takeoff minimums and alternate minimums. In this case, this cannot be used as an alternate if you were flying IFR. So not so much that we would want to use for VFR. However, in this section, there could be notes that say that the AWAS at Carroll County wasn't working properly. They would give you notes on, well, where should you get that information and how to adjust the minimum altitudes for this approach. It gives you an idea of the missed approach. And again, you may or may not want to use the missed approach because you're flying VFR. It's like, I'm hoping what would happen is you would just go around and just enter the pattern if for some reason you had to do a go around, because this is really meant to be if you're in the clouds and having to get up and away from the airport and out of the way of other traffic. So probably not so much something that you would use. And of course, the really nice thing here is they've got all the frequencies that are appropriate for what you're going to be doing. So you can see the AWAS is listed right there. This is the local approach or departure frequency. And then it's got ground control and then the Unicom. And if it was a tower field, it would have the tower frequency as well. Okay, any questions before I move on this one, Dan?
We had a couple questions about radio calls. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. So it said, just because you're using an IAP, don't use identified checkpoints or intersections listed on the IAP to identify your position. Saying you're 5 miles out instead of a specific intersection helps with situational awareness. That was an interesting comment from Dan.
Yeah.
And then there's a general question saying what calls to make, simulated IFR approach or VFR using IFR charts. Any suggestions on how you should be making those calls?
Yeah, I don't know that I would go into the thing I'm doing, and you know, you might say I think I like the idea of saying something like I'm VFR following an instrument approach. But the best thing to do, honestly, to make it usable for all, because even instrument pilots doing practice approaches, especially coming into a non-towered field, or even letting the tower know what you would like to do, um, is to just to use the VFR calls. So it's like you can estimate out. I'm 5 miles out on final. I'm 3 miles out. And I'm coming in kind of a modified straight in for runway 34 in this case, which we'll look at here in a moment. So I would say do the VFR calls. And the reason is I agree, do not use waypoints, because even though the instrument pilots, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to emphasize this, the instrument pilots might know where those waypoints are, depending on how many approaches they've done at that particular airport. The VFR pilots are going to have no idea where they are. So it's much better to use VFR distance calls and kind of what you're doing. I'm coming in on straight in final, or whatever it might be. Use that is going to be the best thing to apply to everybody that might be there. Because just like if you're learning this for the first time now as I'm going through it, other private pilots that are out there that have not done instrument training are going to have no idea what these things are or what they mean.
2 clarification questions, Chris.
Sure.
One was GCO and just a confirmation of what the GCO was.
Okay, so that is a ground communications outlet, if I'm not mistaken, and typically there it's like where you might call for fuel or something. And I'm trying to remember over at Carroll County. I know I've talked to them on CTAF as well, but that's a frequency that they would use on the ground. So you'll see other frequencies listed here that you may not use. So just look for the ones, just like we would be flying VFR. Look for the ones that would be typically applicable to you.
All right, one more quick one. The touchdown zone elevation, MSL or AGL?
That is MSL. So that's always going to be MSL, those altitudes. So it makes it pretty easy.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. All right, let's go to the next part now. And this is the part, these next parts coming up are really going to be the parts where we're going to be looking at the path that we are going to fly. So the first part we're looking at is this top-down view, and it's called the plan view, which I will zoom in on here in just a moment. So here is our plan view. And so what this is basically like a detailed map of the procedure that you want to fly. And then we are going to look in a moment too. There's also one that will show us the sort of a side view. It's called the profile view. So that's coming up in a minute. So let's just think of this as the top-down plan view, and it's got some great information here for you. Number one, it's going to show you where that primary nav aid is. In this case, it's the Westminster VOR. Really cool is that they give you the frequency again, and they give you the Morse code, which is very useful, because if you are using the VOR, you want to make sure you're using the correct VOR. So make sure you ident and listen to it, just like we would when we were doing cross countries and VFR flying. Same thing here. We will certainly do it for instrument flying, even more important. Then it's going to show you the radial that you're using. And again, if you're a little rusty on your VOR or never really fully got it, this is a great opportunity to get really into that VOR use, because it actually is useful. And once you get the hang of it, it's really not as hard as it sometimes seems when you're first learning it. So in this case, it's using the 178 radial in this way. And then it actually, once you get north of the VOR, it's just the reciprocal of it. In this case is the 358 radial going in. And so what you would do is you would come in. This would be up to you and your CFI if you want to get into how to enter it. But what you could do is, if you were kind of coming here down from the south, you could come in and pick up this the 358. In this case, you'd be a 2 indication, and then fly over the VOR. And once you have station passage, then we'll see in a moment that you could then drop down. Notice that in this case, it just has courses. There are no altitudes listed. Sometimes on some of the approaches, depending on how it's set up, they will list the altitudes here as well. But in this case, it's just the course. You're going to be flying the 358, and then you'll be flying north or outbound from the VOR towards the runway. And you'll notice here, which we'll see in a zoomed in view in a little bit, how it's coming in, and it's not quite a straight in because the VOR is not situated for that straight in, but it's going to give you almost a straight in. This is why you get to be talking to people. At Carroll County, the traffic pattern is over here to the northeast all the time. And so we want to let them know I'm coming in from the Westminster VOR and making kind of a modified straight in. I'm a little bit, to the left of a typical straight in final.
And hey, Chris, real quick.
Yeah.
We had a couple notes in our example about position report. We were just talking about location. We didn't, for this example, use altitude. Several
Right.
have pitched in saying, "Hey, you need to do your altitude." Absolutely,
Sure.
you do. There's no discrepancy other than that. For this example, we are just talking about the position, not the position and altitude. But
Right.
yes,
Yeah,
altitude
and it's
should
like
be
if it's
included.
applicable, let them know your altitude and what you're doing, especially
Absolutely.
if you're going to do something other than pattern altitude. And that's up to you. Again, this is where you can work some of that out, depending on with your CFI and the practices you see and where you're going. Now, something useful over here is this minimum safe altitude, and you'll see this on all the approach plates. And so what it's telling you is, and this is again, you have to make sure you understand your VORs, but basically if you're to the southeast of the VOR and it's the line is drawn between the 045, that's a 2 indication, and the 225 indication. So if you're down in this sector, as long as you are above 2,600 feet, you're not going to hit anything. And you also get navigation coverage here. You should be able to pick up the VOR. If you're up to the northeast of it, or sorry, northwest of it, northwest, then you've got 3,400 feet that's going to keep you well clear of anything and able to pick up the signals. Oops, didn't mean to jump there just yet. And then the last little bit I'll show, and again, please make sure you check the legend. Go look at the legend to help you interpret these. The Instrument Flying Handbook, this gives a good overview, and the legend is really useful so you can look at the different symbols and say, what is that? These are towers. And so these are obstructions that are out there, typically lit, and it'll give you the altitude as well. So this little obstruction right here is at 1,144 feet MSL. And you'll note too that on the charts, what they'll do is they'll make one that's a little bit bigger in print and size. That is the highest one in that area, letting you know. So you can clearly see that if I'm coming in, I'm kind of north of the VOR at this point. If I'm at 3,400 feet, I am well clear of any of these obstructions. All right, any questions before I go?
Another clarification question for an IAP that has a letter listed after it, such as VOR B as in Bravo. What does that mean?
So those would be like right now, this one is the VOR 34. So that's letting you know that it is a VOR approach and it's using a runway 34. When the approach course is coming in at an angle that is too far, and I forget the exact number, I don't remember if it's 30 degrees or what, I'd have to go back and look that up. But if the angle is a little too far off that final or the altitude may be too high for you to effectively make a safe normal landing, normal approach to landing from that, they will use something like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. And of course, they'll just rank those up depending on how many there are. If there's only one approach of that sort at an airport, it'll just be the Alpha. If there's two, there'll be an Alpha and a Bravo. So they're letting you know it's not one where you're going to make a straight in approach to landing on a runway, but instead you would have to circle to land. And think of that like flying a pattern. And again, that's something to review with your CFI because I can't do all of it today because otherwise I'd be basically giving you a good chunk of your instrument ground training and trying to do it in 45 minutes or so, which would be difficult.
30 degrees appears to be the angle
consensus
that you were
there
referring to. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so now we've looked at that top-down plan view. Let's take a look, and there's multiple sections in this part down below that we're going to take a look at, and I will zoom in on these and highlight them. So this is the bottom part of the approach, and you'll notice here, before I even zoom in, you can see this has altitudes listed on it, and it shows sort of the side view. So if you could imagine top-down view, and then the one down below is giving you that side view, letting you know where the step downs are in altitude while following it. And then notice right here, we've got 358. Here's the VOR, because it even says, here's the EMI VORTAC or the VOR right there. And it says, once you reach the VOR, like before it, if I'm in this section right here, in this hold is what this is representing, I've got to be at 2,900 feet. Once I'm past the VOR and am on that radial, that 358 radial outbound, then I can drop down and I will explain how to interpret the rest of these altitudes. Because you'll notice it has altitude here. It says at or above. That's what that line means, at or above 2,900 feet. Once I get here, there's none listed because it depends on what you're doing. And that's what we'll talk about when I zoom in.
Hey,
so
Chris,
here we go. Yeah.
That 1 minute, if you could go back, the 1 minute inside that hold outside the initial approach fix,
Yes.
What does that 1 minute signify?
That's for the holding, and that would be how long your legs would be. So that's 1 minute legs on your holding pattern. if for flying VFR, you're like, again, you're probably not doing holds and things like that, because it's like at that point you're getting into instrument flying, and I'm certainly going to encourage you to do that. But for this simple night flying, you probably don't need to do that. But that's just 1 minute for how long you would fly the legs in that hold. Sometimes it'll be in nautical miles if you're using GPS.
Chris, we've had a couple of very intuitive guests with us today that said, hey, your chart has expired, just so you know.
Did that one expire? It's the 18th. It's good today. It expires tomorrow. Yeah, I actually pulled these as current ones because the ones I had previously were really old, like from 2016. So I updated all the ones, but yeah, they expire today, so they will be good until the end of the day. Obviously, I hope I don't need to say, don't use the charts in my presentation for actual navigation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, get your current charts. Okay. For the airport view, so now we're in that bottom section. There's a couple of different views. I will get into this profile view momentarily, but let's just take a quick look at the airport view over here that I've highlighted in red. And again, it's going to show, here's your airport elevation. You'll notice that that was also above in that briefing strip that we used. And here's the touchdown zone elevation again as well. So it's both in the briefing strip and they put it right there in the airport view. Something useful is when we were looking at that over the top plan view, it showed that approach course coming in, and then they show it right here in detail. Here's the airport, here's the runway, gives you the runway length again, even the width. It shows you where the airport beacon is right there. And here is that course coming in. And so they're even telling you, this is that 358 course. Here's runway 34. So you're going to be coming in at an angle. And as we now know, just verified from the help with our folks as well, coming in at less than 30 degrees to that runway. And that's why we can do this. We can call this one that 3-4 approach because it's lined up enough with that runway. There are some timing things here, and honestly, I would not necessarily use these for VFR flying so much. This is for when you're in the clouds and you want to know, like, well, what if I get down and I'm flying in the clouds? How long do I fly until I know I've gone too far? And that's what these timing things are for, depending on how fast you're flying your approach. So it's if you're flying at 60 knots, it'll take you 6 minutes and 30 seconds, calm wind, from the VOR to the end of the runway here. And if, of course, you don't see it at that point in instruments, you would then shoot, you do the missed approach procedure. But we're assuming you're flying VFR, that you've turned on the lights of the runway, and you should be able to see this well away from it. We're just using this for obstacle avoidance. Okay, now let's pop to this next one. Here is that profile view that I was mentioning. You can see I put the titles up here on the corner. And as I mentioned before, here's that 1 minute holding pattern again. If you were to come in, like you're coming into the VOR from the south, you'd want to be at least at 2,900 feet, and that will keep you from making sure you're not going to hit anything and get proper navigation guidance. And then as you cross the VOR, you want to be planned ahead and proceed out on that 358. The question then is, how low can I go without having to worry about hitting anything? Well, down here is your minimum section that will tell you that. So we'll look at these altitudes here just momentarily. The other parts that it's showing you here as well is if you happen to have GPS or DME and you have it set to this VORTAC, and by the way, even for VOR approaches, most of these approaches are found in an IFR certified GPS. If you have that to use, it makes this really easy because it'll even lay it out for you. There's a GPS version that you can use referencing this instrument approach procedure, or we call them plates, referencing this plate that will help you get down. And so at the point where you're 4.5 miles from the VOR, this little V, this kind of a V looking symbol, will let you know at this point you can then proceed down to start your normal landing approach, start your approach to final. And then at 6.5 miles out, that's the point where it's like, okay, the runway, I should be like literally over the threshold of the runway right there. I should be right at the end. And if I were flying instruments, then I would do the missed approach procedure from there. Questions, Dan, before I go?
We're okay.
Okay, cool. All right. And then the last bit, I didn't highlight it, I guess. Let me go back one here real quick. One thing I didn't highlight was I was going to highlight the area down here, and so I was remiss in doing that. But let's take a look at those minimums, and you'll see that the minimums, these are altitudes and visibility minimums that we would use if we were flying on instruments. So this -1, for example, you'll see right here, 1,480-1. This means 1 statute mile visibility. This should not be applicable to you because you should be flying VFR, and I would recommend 6 miles or more if you're flying at night, if not more visibility than that. So certainly anything less than that, I would not recommend going out flying at nighttime in VFR. So this should really not be applicable or anything to worry about, but this altitude is super useful. If you were flying the straight in to runway 34, that's what the S34 stands for, the lowest you should be going before you get to this point right here at this visual descent point is 1,480. So in other words, say I was flying in from the south, I'd stay at 2,900 feet, I'd cross the VOR and get on that, be established on that 358 radial, then I could go down to 1,480. You might even decide you want to stay maybe closer to pattern altitude because it's a little bit higher than this, because this is about 700 feet above the ground. And the reason I know that these are the military ones, and so you can use these as a rough estimate of how high you are. So they give the MSL altitude here. Actually, it's 692. That can't be right. I'll have to look that up. What they're talking. That must be something they use in the military. And then the 700 feet is going to tell you how high you are. So you can roughly know that you're about 700 feet above the ground. So that's a little bit on the high side of the final, but that will keep you safe and from hitting anything till you get to this point, and then you can start your descent down on final. Questions there?
Just a couple of clarifications that the chart expiration from a couple viewers here is not the end of the day. It's actually quite early on that Thursday morning.
Okay.
Every 28 days. So just
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's a good tip, but I can't confirm or deny that one. But it's like I'd have to go and look that up. But I will trust you guys, as I know you know your stuff. But that's an interesting one. I have not seen that one before. The other part is knowing, well, which of these, because notice here it says 1,480 and 2 miles, and then it says not authorized. It has these categories A, B, C, and D. This is based on this information here, which is found in the beginning of the instrument approach chart. I know it's in the instrument flying handbook, but it's based on the speed that your airplane is rated and also the speed at which you're doing the approach. So for example, this speed is based off 1.3 VSO, or your 1.3 times your stall speed in a landing configuration, which is what VSO is. And so it said that if you're 90 knots or less, you can use category A if you're flying 91 to 120 and so on. So since in a Cessna, I can slow it down very easily and be good to go at 90 knots. That's what I would use, is 90 knots to fly this. And then I can use the category A minimums. If I was flying faster than that, like for example, I used to instruct in Seminoles. And so we would fly the approaches at faster than 90 knots because 90 knots was a little too slow for them. So we might do it at 120. Then I'd be using category B minimums and the altitudes that would come with that. In this case, it happens to be that they're all the same, except you'll notice here category C, if you're flying the circling approach, you'd have to go at 1,500 feet instead of the 1,480. And this all has to do with when they calculate out how far out you're going and the turns that you're making, et cetera. Okay. Questions before I go to this next part?
We're good.
Okay. One thing that you can use as well, and this is a slightly more complicated instrument approach. And again, I'm not going to go into detail on this one because we don't have time for me to be able to do that. If you really would like me to go deeper in detail, then let us know in the comments, and that maybe we can do a future episode. But the thing I wanted to point out here was that on this particular instrument approach, this is a VOR DME into runway 21 in Kingman, Arizona. It's got an intersection right here. And so it's going to show you that to identify some of these places where you could be stepping down in the altitude. And notice all the terrain that's around this airport. This is in that same area where I showed that video from the beginning. And so what it's showing you here is there's a radial coming off. And in fact, this one even has an altitude associated with it. So you could actually fly to this Peach Springs VOR, fly down this at 8,300 feet until you reach this intersection and then switch over and start the approach that's 190. This is getting more advanced. So that's, like I said, this is a little more complicated than I might want to use. But it just shows you the intersection here. So it's going to show you the 226 radial from Peach Springs and when it intercepts. In this case, it's going to be the reciprocal of the 190. So that is the 010 radial off of Kingman VOR right there. So getting into a little bit more detail, but just know that the intersections are there, and sometimes they're identified by VOR things. The easiest thing probably to learn how to use is the GPS, if you learn how to set that up, because it just gives you the waypoints all set up, which I'm going to show you here in a second. One thing you'll see on the approaches too, we saw that there was that hold, that oval, like that racetrack shaped pattern. Sometimes you'll see as well this barbed looking thing right here, and this is called a procedure turn. And what we would do with flying on instruments is, while trying to get set up in this, and this might not be one that I want to try to do at nighttime, because look at all these mountains unless I'm really proficient at doing this. is that I would fly outbound on this radial, and then I would get to the point here where they establish it, and then I'd fly 325, and usually for like a minute, a minute to a minute and a half, depending on your speed, out, and then I would turn around, and it looks like this. I would fly outbound 010 on that radial. It's going to tell me to fly 325, which is typically just a 45-degree angle, 325 for the specified amount of time, in this case, typically about a minute or so. All right, and then I'd start a standard rate turn. Remember, using your little turn coordinator, turn it back around, and to fly 145 back inbound. This is just headings, not radials. Inbound till I intercept that radial, and then I can start and turn and start my inbound track on that 190 back in. So that's a little more advanced. Definitely want to review that with an instructor if you wanted to learn how to fly procedure turns. Okay. Whoops, go back one. To me, the VOR is probably the simplest ones. The simple VOR approaches are probably the easiest ones to learn how to do if you're familiar with the VOR. The GPS is really nice too. Probably the most difficult part of doing the GPS is just learning to load the approach and the appropriate settings that you have to do. So if you can learn how to do that, or if you're actually pretty good with your GPS and it happens to be IFR certified, these are really nice. So this is the same setup as the normal approach plate. It's got a little bit more detail. Again, you'd want to work with an instructor to learn this, but it's the same basic, simple stuff that I was teaching you. But the cool thing is you'd be able to fly to this waypoint, ASNP, and then it's going to automatically load. It's going to go boom, and it's going to tell me the next thing. Your next desired track DTK is 164, so I would just twist that, and it's going to load it in for me automatically. And at that point, I would know, and I can look at the altitude right here on the chart, 164 track, going outbound from ASNP, going heading south here, and then I fly at 3,900 feet. It's going to let me know. It's even going to, if you're watching, if you're kind of paying attention, it'll warn me too, like, hey, your next intersection is coming up is Bulls, and then you're going to basically do a 90-degree turn, fly this 074 track, away from Bulls, and now I can drop down to 2,900 feet, and it's going to step me all along. And you'll notice right here, Bulls, C Gap, it looks like Jurix, and VFB is this. It looks like the missed approach, or the it's the missed approach point. Anyway, here's Bulls, C Gap, and Jurix, and it shows you those same altitude step downs as you do it. And notice here, this is where the GPS gets a little bit more complicated depending on what you were doing and what you wanted to do with it. But depending on the type of accuracy and if it had vertical guidance or not, and I'm not going to get into all those details right now, but it gives you different altitudes. This is where you sit down with your CFI and figure out what do I think I could use safely to help me do this. But the GPS is nice if you learn how to use it. One quick tip I wanted to mention was that you can use OBS mode on your GPS, which is something you can learn how to do. And basically you could turn any waypoint into a VOR and it'll behave like a VOR. And so you could turn the airport you're going to into a VOR and then just set the radial, right? Set that like sort of pretend radial lined up with your runway final, and you can use it like a VOR flying a straight in final to the runway where you want to go. So that's a cool little trick you can do with the VOR if you wanted to. And again, making sure you're observing VFR traffic, doing good reporting, all those kinds of things. Okay, one more concept I wanted to do before we get there. We've got about 12 minutes left in our normal amount of time. So I'm gonna see if I can do this. What about taking off at night and we don't want to hit things? I kind of showed you a very quick and quick way of what you can learn to come in for your landing, approach and landing, but what about leaving the airport? Well, in the instrument approach procedures book, there's a thing called departure procedures. And I happen to choose this one, which is Frederick, Maryland, which is where we are right now, based here at AOPA headquarters. There's a section called takeoff minimums in that book, and you can find these again also in the AOPA airport directory. You can find them in ForeFlight, that sort of thing. There's a section here, if you look under the airport, Frederick, Maryland, in that takeoff minimum section, it will give you specific directions of how to depart the airport without hitting anything. And so say, for example, that we wanted to take off from runway 5, it's going to give me step-by-step directions, climbing left turn to heading 340, and then use the Frederick VOR radial 010 to 2,100 feet before proceeding on course. So I would climb out, runway heading, then actually it's going to climbing turn left heading to 340, and then on the Frederick VOR radial outbound to that altitude, and then I can turn on course and I should be clear of hitting anything at that point. And of course, then going into your VFR flight planning. Using these, please understand, is dependent on these three conditions for instrument flying. We use these for instrument flying, so if you're going to use them for VFR flying, same deal. You have to cross the runway, the end of the runway, at least 35 feet AGL. If you're not climbing that much, you got other problems. You probably should be, returning to the airport to land. But so crossing the end of the runway, at least 35 feet AGL. Then you need to climb straight out, runway heading, to 400 feet above airport elevation before you start this turn. So you see that climbing left turn to 340? Well, first, stay runway heading, get to 400 feet AGL above airport elevation, and then start that turn. And then you need to have a minimum climb rate as well, which I'm going to show you. And the minimum climb rate, unless otherwise specified, which sometimes it'll specify something more than that, has to be at least 200 feet per nautical mile. Notice that is not per minute, it's per nautical mile. And you need to convert those. How do I convert those? Questions before I do this chart, Dan, or do you want to hang on for those for the
Keep
end?
going.
Okay. So there is a chart also in that instrument approach procedures book. I believe I found it in the instrument flying handbook as well. You can look this up, but it's this climb chart right here. And what it'll show you is it has your ground speed here. So notice it's not your V speed. You're gonna have to figure out, kind of get an estimate or a good estimate of your ground speed using the wind that's applicable. And then, so say for example, I'm in a Cessna and I'm doing something like, 75 knots. So maybe I default to this 90 knot one where I could interpolate, just like I would if I was using any other kind of chart in a POH, for instance. And then I would look over here to the feet per nautical mile. So I noticed that the absolute minimum I was told is 200 feet per nautical mile. So I could just use this first one for that climb rate. So say I just wanted to use 90 knots. So I'd want to be climbing at least 320 feet per minute. That will keep me on that 200 foot per nautical mile climb gradient. The faster I'm flying, the greater my climb rate in feet per minute would need to be. So if I was flying at 120 knots climbing out, and that's ground speed again, adjusted for wind, 425 feet per minute, and so on. So hopefully that makes sense. So this table, and it's actually bigger, I chopped it down to make it fit on the screen. This table is found in that instrument approach procedures book as well, and you can typically find it in your EFBs. Just go search for it in the documents part. Okay, wrapping it up. Where can I find out more, and what can I do? I already mentioned it's on the handout. There's a link to the FAA's Instrument Flying Handbook, pages 1-12 to 1-32. It's basically in chapter 1. All the stuff that I just talked about is in there. And of course, it has way more detail about instrument flying in there. You can get this book free online. You could learn, if you really want to learn, if you're actually doing instrument training or getting into that, Rod's book has multiple chapters on approach plates, and it's really cool because he actually goes into how they create them, and it gives you a really good idea of how precise we need to be with our flying in his book. So if you really like to get in detail, Rod does a great job of that in his instrument flying handbook. You can check out ASI, and I put a link to this on the handout as well. There's the IFR Procedure Safety Center. We go into some details, and there's an article, I think, from AOPA that I found. It's got just a real brief overview of instrument approach charts. And then finally, before you go do this, use good common sense. Go train with a CFI, practice in a sim. And in fact, you can practice in a sim on your own, but before I would go doing it for real, it would be a good idea to go go to CFI to help you with it, and practice it both in the daytime and nighttime. And then you could find that these could be really, really useful for you in flying your night VFR, even if you're not instrument rated. And I believe, Dan, that's the end there. Let's go ahead and do the official end here, and I'll let you do a little bit about membership, and then we can get to questions. I'm sure we got plenty.
We do lots of specifics about things on the chart, so I don't think we're going to dive into all of that, but we do have a series of questions that we can get through. But really, if you are not yet an AOPA member, we would encourage you to do that. Be part of the world's largest aviation community, in addition to getting some great magazines, probably the best there are out there, some great content and access to those. There's tons of aviation tools and resources available to you as an AOPA member, and also you have access to pilot protection services as well as part of a membership option there. And there's a great series of discounts and products available to just AOPA members. So we encourage you to be an AOPA member. I know I have been for a long, long time, well before I worked here. Appreciated the resources available. We encourage all to join us and be AOPA pilots.
Cool. Next episode coming up May 16th, 2024. You see, we gave up on the UTC because we kept screwing it up for whatever reason. So at 12 to 1 Eastern time, the official time there, is De-Terrifying Stalls, how to get confident and comfortable with less lift. So we'll talk a little bit about stalls, and we'll talk a bit about how you can go. And I know that for me, I was scared of them probably up through my commercial and really until I did my CFI training. So we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about some ways that you can get a little more comfortable with them so that maybe they're not so scary. If you have ideas for future topics, and I know that we had some folks that suggested some after the last episode, please let us know. And so contact us at ftinitiative@aopa.org, or feel free to just jot them or write them right into the comments here, and Stephen can get those out as well. So that is the official end. If you were here for your Wings credit, as long as you were on this live, not on that YouTube part, and you registered using your same email that uses with your FAAsafety.gov account, you're good to go. We are, of course, going to stick around and answer questions and dive deep into whatever things that you would like to know, or as best I can answer, of course.
All right. So early on, Kevin had asked, do you suggest setting special personal minimums for night flight? If so, what considerations would you add?
Absolutely. And in fact, I've put it on handouts in the past, and I've mentioned it in the past, but the Air Safety Institute has a great personal minimums contract. They have one both for VFR and for IFR flying. You can easily find that by just Googling that. It's probably the easiest way to get to it, because I'm not exactly sure where I would find it within ASI's page, but check those out. So, and it's going to walk you through some of those, and it's great because you actually sign it. You sign it with somebody that you trust, and you promise that I'm not going to change my minimums while I'm out flying. So what things would I take into consideration? Certainly visibility, because at night, because it's definitely harder to see. So I'd want to make sure that I'm keeping visibility up pretty high. Probably if it's turbulent at all, because that's going to make things a little more disconcerting, or could potentially like set you up. Because I can tell you, when it comes to night flying, you always hear about getting disoriented, and you hear about stuff, and you're like, and of course I've flown at night during my private, even during my instrument, and it wasn't until I was actually instructing. I had a student that was on the instruments. We were doing some instrument training, and my student was doing a hold over this VOR. It was over the desert in southern Arizona, just south of Phoenix, and I remembered hearing about things like false horizons and all that, and it never happened to me. And we happened to be doing a hold, and we turned outbound away from Phoenix, where there were a bunch of lights, where I had a lot of light reference, and there was this little road kind of going diagonal up the horizon, and not even on the horizon. It was just this road going diagonal with cars on it. And in an instant, I was disoriented. I can remember feeling like, are we turning? And I could, it was just immediate, like I couldn't tell, and I had to look very quickly over at the attitude indicator, and just try to get my bearings again and sort of settle my brain down. So definitely want to have good visuals. I would think maybe you want to fly on a good moonlit night, so you've got better reference to the horizon, and very much consider what you're flying over. Because if you're flying over really like sparsely populated areas and there aren't a lot of lights, that can be difficult to see. So certainly set up your minimums until you get more confidence, and especially in your ability to interpret the instruments and interpret these types of charts to help you be safe.
We had a mention or two that trying to fly instrument procedures as a VFR pilot without the training could get a little complicated.
Oh, heck yeah.
And then another one related to that would be, well, how much training, would you suggest, or what way should a VFR pilot train before they attempt to fly IFR approaches at night?
So obviously the ideal thing to do would be to go with an instructor, preferably an instrument instructor, because they'll be very familiar. Although it's not required for this sort of training, you could go with a CFI that is familiar, because like any CFI is going to have their instrument rating. So someone who's good at that part might be able to help you, but it's a double I, the instrument instructor will be even better. So that's what I'd highly recommend. And the reason is because they'll be proficient at teaching, and tell them I'm just doing this limited scope of what I want to do with it. Of course, on the side of getting more proficient and everything else, it might be a little taste too, where you find out, I really like this, maybe I want to do my instrument rating. But it's something you could use very practically early on. The other thing you could do too is just to help you and for cost efficiency in practicing it, is using a simulator, or like trying to fly them during the daytime as well. Like once you get the idea of how they work and you got a simple approach, you could go up and maybe even take a safety pilot with you. Not that you'll be under the hood, but just somebody else to help you along as well, and just practice some of these procedures during the daytime so that you can get familiar with reading the chart and being able to see before you're dealing with the fact that it's dark outside and you've lost that easy reference to the horizon. So those would be the things I would recommend. And like I said, I have seen people online that do all the flight simming, that really get serious about it, and they learn how to fly instruments on a simulator without any instrument instruction, just basically teach themselves using videos off of YouTube. I would not recommend doing that to go fly in the airplane for real, but it's certainly a great resource to increase your ability and get familiar with this and be cost efficient with it. But yeah, I'd say the definitely thing is get a good CFI before you go do this for real. But
Okay.
I honestly think you could do this really, really efficiently.
Any concerns with clearance since we're flying VFR then at the same space that IFR traffic could be flying?
Sure, that's where it'd be a great thing to maybe use flight following. Or if you are flying, like say you're out flying in class echo airspace, so it's non-controlled, and maybe you're not using flight following for some reason, and you're just doing like a little local hop here, that's where those VFR calls come in, because the instrument pilots will be doing the same thing, and let them know if you hear somebody like that, let them know, hey, I'm doing a VFR approach on this, and they'll know what you mean. I'm flying the VOR 34 into Carroll County, VFR. So let them know what you're doing, and that should help. Because remember, if they're actually on an instrument clearance as well, number one, they're VFR, so they have to follow VFR traffic separation themselves. They've got to be looking for traffic, and ATC is looking out for them. And that's why if you use flight following, now you're talking to the same folks, and just communicate.
Good. So VFR approach, you're coming in for a straight in as if you were on an instrument plan. Should you call a long final, or should you enter as VFR traffic overhead and then do a full pattern? What's the
These
best
are
way to get in the runway environment there, airport
use the
environment?
common sense here. There's nobody at the airport. You've been calling, nobody's there. You've been watching, maybe you've got your ADS-B going, there's nobody there. You can probably safely just make a straight in final to landing, right? And obviously making very clear calls about what you were doing. If there's other traffic there, then treat it like it's a pattern entry of some sort. And so you could kind of like let them know what you want to do. If there's a lot of traffic there, maybe you should be reconfiguring this whole thing and coming in on the 45 anyway. But as we typically know, most of the time flying at night, traffic is usually a lot less and a lot lighter. So I would be surprised if you run into an airport that's got a ton of traffic, but plan accordingly. What's your backup plan if that happens? What you don't want to do at nighttime is then be coming and busting in the pattern where people are flying. And it's like, you still have to follow VFR rules. People on instrument clearances have to follow VFR rules. Even if they were in the clouds, when they break out, if there's VFR traffic there, they have to follow VFR. They don't get priority over VFR traffic just because they're on an instrument clearance when it comes to flying the pattern at a non-towered field.
Okay. Note from Ken about MSAs on approaches other than VORs. They can be centered around other points. It
Yes.
doesn't always have to be centered around a VOR.
Correct. And in fact, just as an example of that, let's pop roll back real quick on that GPS one. This one here is your MSA, and it's around this waypoint. So it's around the runway 07R waypoint, which is basically right at the end of the runway. So within 25 nautical miles of the end of the runway, that runway R risky, was it Romeo Whiskey 07 Romeo, you stay at 7,800 feet, you're not going to hit anything.
Speaking of obstacle clearance, we didn't, I don't think, talk about the PAPI or the VASI, but that provides a certain level of obstacle protection as well using that tool.
Absolutely. And in fact, let me go back here. And again, it was just me trying to fit everything in that I didn't necessarily talk about that. But on the airport diagram on these, you'll see right there, it's showing there's a PAPI, and it'll actually give you information about the lights that are there. Let me, in fact, let's go, for example, this one does not have a whole lot. Maybe that one on Deer Valley does. It'll talk about the different types of lights that are there. So in fact, it says right here, in this, in fact, let's go back to, I don't think Carroll County had any. Oh, they do. So you can see right here, it's got runway end identifier lights. These, by the way, all these abbreviations are explained in that legend that I was talking about that comes with the instrument approach plates, or it can be found in you just got to figure out where it is in your EFB. But runway end identifier lights on runways 16 and 34, There's the little L with the oval around it, means it's pilot controlled lighting. And then medium intensity runway lights, so that'd be the lights around the edge, or runways 1, 6, and 3, 4, and again, pilot control. That's the typical thing we always learn about, clicking on the frequency to turn them on. And then it's got a PAPI as well right there. And so it's going to let you know that there's a visual indicator for you to use. So yeah, obviously use those. That'll help you from hitting anything as well. Don't go below glide path.
While we're on this chart and that table that you had put in about the speeds, is that ground?
Which
speed, the VSO?
Oh, VSO, yeah. So this speed is actually 1.3 VSO based on the airplane's categorization. This is really an airspeed that you're going to be flying. So if I'm flying at 90 knots indicated, then I would use these categories.
Okay.
You do need to consider the fact, though, that say you're coming in with a hellacious tailwind and like you're flying 90 knots indicated, but you've got a 30 knot tailwind putting you at 120. Well, obviously that's going to affect the timing on things like this. So adjust accordingly. You know, that's where that common sense part comes in. It's like your ground speed, not sure why you're trying to use an approach that's going with the wind like that, but you know, kind of interpolate and adjust with that wind and what's going on. So I hope that makes sense. But these are based on your VSO. It's going to be indicated speed and for what category you should be using. But use good common sense.
All right. Now I'm looking through a few of the comments that have come in since. So hang with me for a moment while I get caught up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, Chris, I think we've gotten it covered.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully what everybody gets out of this too is that there is a tool here that you can use for flying on flying VFR at night. And with a little bit of practice, a little bit of reading, and then a little bit of training, you could effectively start to use these. And the other thing I didn't even mention was there are IFR and route charts, which are like sectional charts. You can use those too to help plan out routes, and those have minimum altitudes as well. So you could potentially use those when it comes to obstacle avoidance. And it's not super hard. And again, maybe you get a little taste for this too, and you decide, yeah, maybe I want to do my instrument rating because I really like mine. And yes, somebody says, what about ForeFlight? Of course, yes, you can absolutely use ForeFlight to help you with things like this and even like lay out your patterns and everything. But and in fact, ForeFlight will show you all these different charts. You can get them all, and same with Garmin Pilot, etc.
All right.
So I see somebody there, Santosh, is asking, what's the difference between a GCO and the Unicom? That's a great question because I've actually tried to look that up, and it just depends on really local airport usage. Generally, I know that there are definitions in the AIM, and I'd have to go look them up to get you the exact definitions, but it really comes down to local airport usage because there's the Unicom that they might speak on, there's that ground control part of it that they might use. So it's you can see on this one right here, they've got the ground control. This is a towered one. There's a Unicom 12295, but then the towered frequency 118.4 is also the CTAF, which is normally what we would call on. We might use this to call fuel, but then a lot of times fuel places, FBOs, have their own frequency that you would call. So you just have to ask locally on what they're doing.
Awesome. I think we're good, bud.
Oh, and somebody mentions here, just real quick, Peter saying GCO connects you radio to a flight service station. In fact, let's go back and look. Maybe he might be right about that. Let's go back and look at this. The GCO, so 121725. Let's double check it up. That very well might be true that it gets you to the flight service station to talk to them and get a clearance out. So he might be right. That's a good one. So, all right. All right, anyway, I guess we're good to go.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for being here. If you have questions or if you have any suggestions for us on topics that you'd like to see again in the future, if you want me to go deeper into any of this, let us know in the comments. Shoot us an email at ftinitiative@aopa.org, and we will be really happy to see you guys again next time right here, May 16th, 2024, 12 to 1 Eastern, de-terrifying stalls. Thanks for being here. And on behalf of Dan and Steven and Chris, all in the background, we appreciate you guys.
See ya. Thanks.
Bye-bye.